Welcome to the new Australians for Science and Freedom interview series. My name is Jason Strecker and I'm a director at ASF. At ASF, we welcome the free exchange of ideas, free from censorship, for the betterment of society. ASF neither endorses nor rejects any of the views expressed today or in any of the interview series, but we heartily endorse the free and open exchange of ideas for the betterment of society. Today, it is with great pleasure that I introduce economist, researcher and recognised expert on guns and crime, John Lott. John has an impressive list of achievements. He is president of the Crime Prevention Research Centre in Utah. He has served as the senior advisor for research and statistics in the US Department of Justice. He has held research and teaching positions in the University of Chicago, Yale, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, Stanford University and UCLA. He holds a Ph.D. in Economics from the UCLA. And he's a published author of many works intended for the research community and lay audiences, including his book, More Guns, Less Crime, whose first edition was published in 1998. John, welcome to Australia and thank you for making yourself available to be interviewed.
Oh, thanks. It's great to be back in your beautiful country.
Many Australians think Americans are gun crazy. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think people are concerned about being able to go and protect themselves. My research shows that police are extremely important. I think police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But the thing is, even the police recognize that they almost always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. In New South Wales, where we're at right now, the average police response time for an urgent emergency call is slightly over 11 minutes. And that's even assuming the person's in a position where they can make a call. I mean, often you can't just tell the criminal, could you please wait while I make a call to the police here? And so the question is, what should people do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? And simply telling people to behave passively turns out to be very dangerous advice, particularly for people who are relatively weaker physically, women, the elderly. If my research convinced me of anything, it's the most vulnerable people in society who benefit the most from owning guns. The people who are the most likely victims of violent crime, and that overwhelmingly tends to be poor minorities, and people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly.
That's a pretty good place to start. I recently had the opportunity to catch up with the editor of Epoch Times, Jan Jekielek, and he defined courage as doing the right thing regardless of the consequences, understanding that it could be persecution as a result of that. Some might say it is courageous of you to come to Australia at this time knowing the general view of guns, and particularly after the Bondi Beach massacre in December last year, less than 2 months ago. Why do it?
Well, the reason why I do it is because I want to make sure people are safer. And unfortunately, you have a lot of different laws that make people less safe, and that rather than going back and saying, well, maybe we should revisit and undo the laws that are there, they kind of double down on it. And we've seen that in the United States. You have areas that go and ban guns. People think that if we could just go and ban guns from particular areas, that will make people safer. The problem is that when you do that, you actually create magnets for murderers to go and do the attacks. So you may have we had a school shooting in Minneapolis, Minnesota in September. If you or I were to take a gun onto school property there, it's a 5-year prison term. That's a pretty hefty penalty. Our lives would be completely changed as a result of that. But let's say you're the murderer there. He killed 2 people, wounded 17 others. Even assuming he had lived, and often when people do these attacks, they die at the scene, as this one did. But even assuming he had lived, he'd likely be facing maybe 5 or 6 life sentences. Does taking 5 years away from his 6th or 7th life represent a real penalty to him? And the answer is no. What you've done is you've set up a penalty system to make sure that the law-abiding citizens are the ones who are going to face the real big penalty and will be following the law. And so all you've done is assure the criminal that he'll be the only one that will have a weapon there. And so time after time, if you read the diaries or manifestos for these murderers, even though the media doesn't cover this part of them, they explain why they pick the targets that they do. And they do that because they know they'll be the only person with a gun in that place. Their goal is to get media attention. They know the more people they kill, the more media attention that they're going to get. And they know if they go to a place where guns are banned, they'll be able to kill more people and get more media attention. And so, but rather than go back and say, maybe we should undo these gun-free zones that we have, the government goes and says, let's pass more and stricter gun control laws. We'll ban certain types of guns, or ban, magazines, or ban something else that's there. And the problem with so many of these laws is that they primarily impact law-abiding good citizens and not the criminals. And to the extent that you primarily disarm law-abiding citizens, you make it easier for criminals to go and commit crimes.
Yeah, and that probably works, is a nice transition to think about Australia when you say gun-free zones, and introduce an article that you and Keston Green, an Australian academic, wrote recently for The Spectator magazine, but also appears on your website as well. But just before we get to that, I just want to set a bit of a stage. My family and I had the opportunity to travel to the US in the last 6 months, so just recently. And it's been interesting, the response from a lot of people in Australia, so friends and well-meaning people, legitimately asked us, did you feel safe while in the US? And the follow-up response is, I'm glad we don't have guns in Australia. With this background, can you describe for your audience the analysis that you and Keston undertook for your Spectator piece and how you interpret the findings?
Well, we had two pieces there. One was based on some research that I've done looking at active shooting attacks in the United States. The FBI defines active shooting attacks where guns fired in public to harm somebody, not part of some other type of crime like a gang fight over drug turf or a robbery. Anything from one person being shot at and missed all the way up to a mass public shooting. And looking at all the cases from 2014 to 2024. And what we found was that police have an incredibly difficult job in stopping these types of public shootings. And the reason is because they're in uniform. And I don't think people appreciate what a difficult job police have. So let's say somebody wants to go and shoot up an area. If there's an officer there, they have real tactical advantages. They can either wait for the officer to leave the area before they attack, or they can move on to another target themselves. Both of those make it relatively less likely that the officer will be present at the time of the attack. But if the attackers insist on attacking where the officer is, who do you think they shoot first? Having somebody in uniform is kind of like having a neon sign above them that says, shoot me first. And in fact, we found that even though legally armed civilians stopped more of these attacks than police did, police were 12 times more likely to get killed in these active shooting attacks than civilians. Simply, there's good reasons why we have officers in uniforms, but I don't think people appreciate how much of a target that makes them and how dangerous it makes their job when you're talking about criminals doing the attacks. And so, when somebody's carrying concealed, so like in the United States, we have about 21 million Americans with a concealed carry permit. We have 29 states, which are so-called constitutional carry states, where it's no longer necessary to have a permit to be able to go and carry. And the thing is, so you may have 15% or so of the adult population which is carrying either all the time or at least some of the time. And, you can understand why these killers in their diaries and manifestos try to pick out gun-free zones, because they're worried that a civilian might stop them. In the Minneapolis shooting I mentioned earlier, in his manifesto, he goes to great detail, even though the media refuses to cover these types of discussions, he goes into great detail explaining not only why he picked the school, because it was a gun-free zone, and he knew nobody else would have a gun there, but the time of day. He didn't want to go in the morning when parents were dropping off kids at school, or in the afternoon when they're picking them up, because he was worried that one of the parents might have a permanently concealed handgun and might use it to go and stop his attack. So, so I understand the desire to try to make places safe by just banning guns. The problem that you deal with is that you actually make it easier for attacks. And I'll just mention one other thing, and that is you can just look at countries or cities or areas that have just banned guns, either all guns or all handguns. You would think that if banning guns made places safer and they think guns are bad on net, it should be very easy to find places where there's drops in murder rates when a ban has occurred. Every single time in any place in the world where either any place has banned either all guns or all handguns, murder and homicide rates have gone up. They haven't even stayed the same. You think out of randomness, once or twice it would go down. But every single time it's gone up, and sometimes it's gone up by 3, 4, 7-fold increases that are there. And basically what you see, similar to the gun-free zone stuff, is that you may take a few guns away from the criminals, but if you're primarily disarming law-abiding good citizens with these rules, you actually make it easier for criminals to go and commit crimes.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I looked at the Bondi footage, so the Bondi massacre footage, and looked at the timings, look, we had some real heroes that stepped up and put their life on the line to take down the perpetrators. But I saw significant gaps that worried me in the response times to taking these people down. They were free to move around and free to...
Well, they had time to kill 15 people and wound 43 others that were there. So, I mean, it's amazing that you have these heroes in society, but could you imagine how much more effective they would have been if they had had a weapon to be able to go and do it? I mean, the irony is one guy who took the weapon away from the younger killer there, he put it down rather than going and use it to go and try to stop the father that was there. And I assume that's just because he's conditioned or something like that, not to be able to go and use a gun. But, you know, he might have been able to stop the father also if he had been willing to go and use the weapon.
I think that's a really good point, and that probably goes back to some of the comments I'd had about a real fear around guns. Like, by touching a gun, I might suddenly be accidentally, it goes off and shoots myself, or some danger result in it. And I guess probably to bring perspective on the Americans, so people don't just think it's the Americans, after I looked at the timelines, I had someone that's not American that came up to me and has some experience in the area, and he said virtually the same thing from a completely other country. He said that wouldn't happen in my country, what took place. The person would have been shot much earlier in the piece, and there'd be people alive today.
Right. Well, I mean, I've seen multiple numbers on how long it took the police to arrive on the scene there, anything from 5 minutes on up. You know, I suppose eventually we'll know exactly the amount of time that it took, but obviously, you know, even 5 minutes, even if that turns out to be the case, a lot of harm can occur there. And, you know, when you look at what motivates these mass murderers, either in Europe I've studied or in the United States, they want to go and get attention. And so how do you know, in some of the countries, like your country, you're kind of restricting speech. In the United States, we have the First Amendment, but you don't need to get rid of the First Amendment or rewrite it. I'm not even sure how one would do it. But the thing is, you can still stop these attacks if you can convince them they're not going to get media attention. And the way you convince them is by indicating to them, look, you're not going to be able to kill many people. Because they know, you know, you take somebody like the Sandy Hook mass murderer in the United States. He had done, according to police, what was the equivalent of a doctoral dissertation, where he had looked at mass murders around the world over the previous 40 years and had graphed out the relationship between the number of people killed in an attack and the amount of media coverage that they had gotten to convince himself, I don't know why he needed to convince himself, but to convince himself that the more people he could kill, the more media attention that he could get. And his goal was to go and kill more people than the Norway killer had killed. If you ignore the bombing deaths, the Norway killer in 2011 had shot to death 67 people. And because he wanted to get more worldwide news attention. Now, I can't prove this, but my guess is the reason why he picked an elementary school was in part the shock value, the fact that, by killing little kids, it would help him get more media attention than he would get otherwise. So rather than a sign in front of a place that says this place is a gun-free zone, I would want to have a sign that says, warning, select teachers and staff at the school are carrying. So in the United States, we have about 14,000 schools in the United States that allow teachers and staff to carry. We have about 100,000 public schools. There has not been one single attack since 2000 at any of those schools that have teachers and staff carrying where anybody's been wounded or killed. All the attacks have occurred in schools that don't allow teachers and staff to be able to go and carry.
Along those lines, so there's a lot so just to unpack what you've just said a little bit more. As part of our travels, we were in Washington, D.C., which I think I mentioned. And as we wandered around the touristy areas of the mall and White House, there were police there in easy-to-do areas. But when we went off the main strip and went to maybe a slightly darkened alley or a series of restaurants or whatever it was, which was away, we actually saw a lot of the National Guard there, and they were grouped together in groups of 2 or 3.
Right.
And that was unusual for us. We've never seen that before. And it got me thinking one time, sitting down having some lunch and just watching these 3 guys. They weren't doing anything. They were just standing there. And I thought, you know what? They actually look pretty formidable. And if I was tempted to commit a crime, that would make me not commit that crime.
Sure.
And it made me wonder whether that had an impact on the businesses around in terms of feeling.
Oh, I'm sure. Look, this isn't rocket science. If you want to reduce crime, you have to make it riskier for criminals to commit crime. Higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates, longer prison sentences. Also allowing victims to be able to go and defend themselves. All those things can make it riskier for criminals to commit crime. And in D.C., President Trump did all those things. He federalized law enforcement for a month, basically took over the D.C. Police Department, put in FBI agents and other federal agents there on the ground, so you increased arrests dramatically there. You had a new U.S. attorney there for D.C. D.C. is unique in terms of the federal prosecutors there prosecute all crimes by adults. Under the Biden administration, they had a very different view about prosecuting people. In 2022, the Democratic U.S. attorney there refused to prosecute almost 2/3 of the crimes that result in arrest. In 2023, it was like 56% of the arrests he refused to prosecute. The Trump administration is dramatically different in terms of prosecuting them. And they're getting real sentences now. Plus, previously it had been taking like 8 months or so to go and get an approval for a permit to be able to go and carry a gun in D.C. And now the Trump administration put pressure on D.C. and they've reduced it to 2 weeks to be able to go and get a permit. So all those things matter. And the fact that you have people there that can go and stop criminals or arrest them, or at least let them know that there's going to be in trouble if they try to go and do something like you're talking about with the National Guard. All those things matter. To me, the irony is so many Democrats attacked Trump for saying it wasn't going to help. It was going to actually make things worse in the city. They said Trump was racist because the only reason why he was taking over the law enforcement was because it was a heavily black city that was there. The thing is, they went 18 days during that month that they first federalized the law enforcement there without a murder occurring in D.C. You're a mathematician. The statistical odds of that, based on what the rate of murders were in the couple months beforehand or in the year before, is like 1 in 85,000 or something like that. And the thing is, whose lives were being saved? The latest data that we have is from 2021 on the racial composition of the murder victims, and 96% of those who were murdered were blacks. So whose lives do you think you're saving from this? You know, they attack Trump for being a racist, but it's basically lives of black individuals who are being saved as a result of them doing that. And, you know, you mentioned businesses and stuff. You know, people look often at just the direct victims of crime, but there are many indirect victims. When you have higher crime rates, businesses close, or they may have to charge higher prices because higher insurance is there. But when the businesses close or have to cut back on employees, who do you think loses their jobs? Who do you think loses the stores that they would be shopping in? Who do you think owns homes in those areas whose property values are depressed because of the higher crime rate? You know, in a city like DC, which is overwhelmingly black, you know, you're basically talking about blacks that are being harmed there in all those different ways. And so, you know, for people to go and claim that Trump is racist, I would just say, you know, who's benefiting from this thing? You know, there's a survey a while ago in Chicago asking people, do they support, would they support Trump federalizing law enforcement in Chicago the way he had done in DC? And blacks and Hispanics were in favor of it. Hispanics were strongly in favor of it. The people who were against it were basically whites, you know, and from best I can tell, it's basically well-to-do whites that are there, who are the least impacted by the crime to begin with. So, you know, they can kind of, you know, it's easy for them to kind of go and be this morally superior people, say, well, we don't want, you know, federal government involved in doing it. But they're not the victims of crime. So the people who are victims of crime, we're saying, yes, please bring in the support.
Do you think that's an indication of exacerbation around local authorities not doing what they perceive their job and hence wanting to defer responsibility federally? Or is it an affirmation of Trump's approach to
Well, I think what I will say is that Democrats have a certain view on the world, and at least they're very consistent. You know, I'm an economist. To me, it just seems self-evident that if you make crime riskier for criminals to commit, there'll be less crime that would occur. But you'll have a lot of them that would say, you know, you could empty the prisons. Mamdani, the new mayor of New York City, thinks we shouldn't have prisons. And he thinks that would have no detrimental impact on crime rates. AOC, the congresswoman from that area, has said that she thinks that higher rates of arrests actually causes more crime. So it's a very different mindset. And so, you know, they seem to honestly believe that if you cut back on police, you know, so that to fund the police movement or other things, you actually make places safer. And, you know, I think Trump, I mean, we've seen this huge drop in crime rates in the United States. This last year, we saw what looks like, at least through October, over a 20% drop in murder rates. That's the largest, it's like 21% at least. That's the largest percent drop in murder that we've ever seen since they've recorded the data. And it looks like the murder rate in the United States will be the lowest ever. Wow. And there are lots of things that are going on. So it looks like it'd be like 3.9 per 100,000. And there are lots of things that are going on. One is you have the U.S. attorneys across the country are prosecuting cases. You have Trump, to varying degrees, has moved federal law enforcement into Memphis and to smaller degrees into Chicago and Portland, moved them into New Orleans, places that had been very high murder rates in the U.S. And but he's also been deporting illegal aliens that are there, criminal illegal aliens. And that's had two impacts. One is, obviously, you've removed those criminal illegal aliens from the streets. But at the same time, even the ones you haven't caught don't want to be deported. And as soon as they get caught and arraigned, even before, without going to trial, they'll get picked up by immigration officers and deported right at that point. So how do you keep from being deported? Well, you keep off of police radar. And how do you keep off of police radar? You don't commit any crimes right now. And so I think it's impacted that. It's not a coincidence that during the Biden administration, we had the largest percentage increase in felony violent crimes ever recorded over 4 years. It was a 59% increase. So we have that huge increase. At the same time, we have this massive inflow of illegals coming into the country. And now that they're deporting them, we see this huge drop in murder. And I think when the data comes out in September, we'll see a huge drop in violent crime across the board. At the same time, we're removing these criminal illegal aliens from the country.
There was an insightful article in the Epoch Times I read a little while ago, which talked on Florida and the way it was handling illegal immigrants and crimes. And the reason why it focused on that is because it was actually a Democrat in charge of the implementation. And his view was rather interesting, and I thought it brings context of it, is that this doesn't have to be a partisan issue. He viewed it himself as being, this is an America issue. This is not a Republican or a Democrat.
Right. Well, I mean, it shouldn't be, but it's pretty divided in terms of the views on that. I mean, you have Democratic mayors in New York City and Chicago and in California cities and other places that basically say that they'll work hard against ICE being able to go and deport these individuals. In Seattle, the mayor there is having police, rather than help and protect the ICE officers, she's having them go and film the ICE officers that are there and just stand by when violence occurs. I suspect you've heard about what's been going on in Minneapolis. The sad thing is that the two people who died, Renee Good and Alex Preddy, they probably would be alive today if Minneapolis police actually worked to control the riots that were going on there and the people who were interfering with the officers. You have lots of other very liberal areas in the country, like Austin, Texas, or whatever. You don't see those things happening because they know if they go and they interfere with ICE officers, the police in those areas will go and arrest the individuals, and they'll be punished. So they don't go and do those things.
Yep. I'll come back to that, Matt, perhaps a bit later. But one of the things you mentioned is actually the First Amendment, which is freedom of speech. And one of the things I found, an observation, is that it's often been the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and the Second Amendment, right to bear arms, which are often used in the same type of sentence as a core value. Is that something that's particularly American? Is it a reason why you can describe that being the case?
Well, we have a whole Bill of Rights. There are 10 parts to the Bill of Rights.
Yep.
And the First Amendment, guarantees not only free speech, but freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, other things that are there. And, it's pretty strong. It says Congress shall pass no law. And the Second Amendment, we had just been through the American Revolutionary War, kind of the first shots that were fired in 1775 was the British troops going to Lexington and Concord in order to try to seize colonial arms that were there. And obviously, if they had been successful in doing those things, the Revolutionary War would have turned out very differently. But obviously it was more than just trying to keep government under control. It was people being able to go and protect themselves. There was understanding that, particularly when people were living out in a countryside or whatever, you only have yourself to protect yourself. And but I would go and argue, if anything, it's more important today in many urban areas. So anyway, we have a whole Bill of Rights that are there, and I don't like to make rights type arguments. It's not what's interested me. What's interested me is what can we do to make people safer. And I think, for many people in the middle of the debate, they're willing to trade off freedom for safety. And I think this, with regard to gun ownership, it's one thing where freedom and safety tend to go together. But it's interesting just looking around the world, whether it's Australia or the UK or the European Union or Canada. You have all these countries which are moving to greatly restrict free speech, putting people in jail and other things for speaking out. I know Australia just passed new hate speech laws. I don't really think that stops the hate that's there. It may drive it underground to some extent, but it also makes it so that people can't expose it and go after and criticize it too. And I think that's probably extremely important for people to be able to openly say that, there's certain groups that have bad views and are dangerous and are threatening others, and to expose that and be able to talk about it. So I don't think that that's particularly productive. But as you say, we have a First Amendment in the United States. Now, that doesn't mean there are not lots of politicians in the United States that would like to do what is happening in Australia and other countries. My guess is if Kamala Harris had won in the 2024 election, we'd see more of what the Biden administration was doing, which was they were putting pressure on social media companies to go and remove content or censor it that they didn't agree with on things. And obviously what they might have thought was, incorrect content might be very different from what I would think that's there. And that's one of the dangers of having the government go and do that.
And full circle, when we're talking about Australia again, if we come back to the Spectator magazine article called "Australians are dramatically more likely to be the victims of violent crime than Americans." It's up on Spectator magazine, it's on crimeresearch.org. I encourage all our viewers here today to go and read it because it's enlightening in your view on it.
Yeah, I have to say, one thing that's interesting to me is how ill-informed Australians are about their own country, okay? And when I've talked to Australians or when I read the media, there's this perception that Australia is a very safe country, okay? And your own government statistics belie that. So people have to understand there's basically two measures that you have of crime. There's crimes reported to police, all right? And by that measure, Australia doesn't look too bad. But there's also the fact that most crimes aren't reported to police. So, for example, the Australian Bureau of Statistics has a survey that they do each year. It's a large survey. And they ask people, have you been victims of crime? And what you find is that it's really high. Something like burglaries are like 3 times higher than the burglary rate in the United States. Rapes are a couple times higher than in the United States. But one of the things you also see, even by their own numbers, is like only about 19% of rapes are reported to police in Australia. In the United States, it's like rapes and sexual assaults. In the United States, it's like 45%. And so you can see when you have that huge difference in the reporting rate, that looking at just reported crimes could miss the other 81% of the crimes that are there and give you kind of very misleading view. Now, there's one big problem, or a couple problems, but one big problem with the Australian numbers, and that is even the survey data is a little weird because they ask you, they don't count the number of crimes that you've faced. So if you've been burglarized 3 times in a year, that only counts as 1. The US data counts it multiple times. It would count as 3 there. And the same is true for other crime categories. And so if you were to make adjustments for that, it's pretty clear that Australia has a much, 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 much higher violent crime and property crime rate, multiple times higher than the United States. Now, there used to be something called the International Crime Victimization Survey that was done up until 2005. The UN took it over and basically killed it at that point, and I think for political reasons. But one of the nice things about the International Crime Victimization Survey was that it was a large survey done with the exact same definitions of crime across all the different countries that were there at the same time. And at the time, Australia had a violent crime rate that was about 75% higher than the violent crime rate in the United States. My guess is, if anything, the gap has actually increased since then. But so the thing is, Australia has a lower murder rate than the United States does, but murder may make up 1% or something of violent crime. In Australia, maybe even a lower percentage. But other crimes like robbery, rapes, and sexual assaults, and assaults generally tend to be, and burglaries, those are much higher in Australia than in the United States.
I find that first statistics you said about the way the Australians are covering the statistics about accumulating basically multiple instances into one, I find that quite shocking. Obviously from a mathematics and statistics.
Well, you should ask the government about that. The Australian Bureau of Statistics. It doesn't seem like it's a lot more data that they have to go and collect there. You're interviewing the individuals, asking them, have they been a victim of particular crimes over the past year? The thing is, crimes tend to be concentrated in certain areas. And it's not going to be too surprising that if somebody's house is burglarized once, there's a good chance it could be burglarized a second time. So you'd want to take that into account. And so, but, that's a decision somebody in the government made a while ago. And the thing is, the media here, one is the media here seems to rely only on reported crimes. No notion between the gaps between reported and unreported. And there's no questions about anything deeper in terms of the problems with the statistics.
One of the things I love about my position in the ASF is being able to speak with a lot of diverse groups of people and get their views. And one young person raised this question to me recently, and it's this: Australian urban youth culture hasn't experienced gun use, hence all their information comes from mainstream media, which publicises negative detriments such as school shootings.
Right.
What would your advice be to young people in how to go about challenging mainstream views, such as what questions to ask or how to properly read the statistics?
Well, yeah, I agree. It's a huge problem. There are many problems with how the media worldwide, including the United States, covers it. So, for example, we've covered a couple things, like when you have these mass shootings, the media may cover the fact that they have a diary or manifesto and may mention it. They may say the person talks about other mass murderers that were there, but they ignore why they picked the target. Now, it seems to me that's newsworthy, why they're picking the target. I'd like somebody to give me a benign explanation why you will just never, ever, ever see any of the media say, and he picked that target because guns were banned in that place. There's media bias in terms of just covering defensive gun uses. So on our website at crimeresearch.org, we've collected, since going back many years, but even just since 2020, about 50 cases where police have said, if it hadn't been for the presence of a concealed carry permit holder, you would have had a mass public shooting occurring. But national media just ignores those cases. I mean, I can give you lots of examples. You have something like the Pulse nightclub shooting that occurred. At the time, it was the worst mass public shooting in U.S. history. It was near Orlando, Florida. And 1 week after that, at a nightclub in South Carolina, somebody tried to do a similar type of attack. They took out their gun, had shot 3 people, were shooting at a 4th, when a man with a permanent concealed handgun shot and wounded the attacker and stopped the attack. The attacker still had something like 125 rounds of ammunition on him when he was stopped. Now, the difference between South Carolina and Florida, Florida is one of 10 states that ban people being able to go and carry permanent concealed handguns in places that got more than half of their revenue from alcohol. South Carolina was one of 40 states that allowed people to go and carry in those establishments. The Pulse nightclub shooting was getting coverage for months after the attack, worldwide coverage. You will look in vain to see basically anything other than local media coverage of the case in South Carolina. But you can imagine if the person hadn't been there, hadn't stopped the attack, and you had had the deaths that could have arisen with 125 more rounds of ammunition there, that it would have gotten the same type of, maybe even more national attention and international attention than the Pulse nightclub attack had gotten. I'm sure you know about the Parkland school shooting in Florida. Just shortly after that, there was an attack at another school in Florida. An elementary school was having a celebration in the park right next to the school there. Hundreds of parents, hundreds of students, teachers were there. A man came up, started firing his gun. Fortunately, because it was in a public park and not in the school, people were allowed to carry. And there was a man there who had a permanent concealed handgun and shot and seriously wounded the attacker and stopped the attack. Again, only local news coverage that were occurring. The Parkland school shooting was getting coverage for years after the attack. But nobody in the media thought, saying, well, you know, why did this turn out differently than this other attack had happened there? When over the years, I would go and talk to editors at different news bureaus, and I'd say, you know, you guys cover things like what type of gun was used or how they obtained the gun. Often the initial news reports on that are wrong. Why don't you ever mention whether or not this person picked a gun-free zone? Many times that's much easier to determine quickly whether that was the case or not. And so I was told, well, John, it's important that we get that information within the news cycle. So I spent a fair amount of time collecting that information quickly and giving it to them, but they would still never use that. And so I went and I talked to the editors at this one place, and I said, look, I don't understand. You asked me to go and get you this information. I got you the information. I've documented it for you, but it doesn't get in the news stories. And say, yeah, well, we think it'd just be too political for us to put that in there. And I said, I guess I don't understand. The fact that these guys keep on picking these places where guns are banned, why is mentioning that any more or less political than going and mentioning what type of gun was used, or go and mention how they obtained the gun that was there? And my guess is the whole debate that we have on guns, if any of those things were handled differently. You know, and the other thing is, people have this myth that the United States is somehow unique in terms of mass public shootings. And that's simply false. I mean, if we just compare only Western Europe to the United States, let's say just since 2010, can you name me where the two worst mass public shootings have been?
Not for public shootings, no, I couldn't.
They're in Europe.
Yeah.
You have France, the concert shooting in late 2015, where 130 people were shot to death. You have the Norway killer in 2011, where 67, ignoring the bombing deaths, where 67 people were shot to death. Those are both significantly worse than the worst mass public shooting in the United States. But you know, you go and you talk to people. When I talk to people around the world, they immediately think that the United States has the worst. The other thing is people don't adjust for population. So I'll give you an example. You mentioned school shootings again. Since 2000, the United States has had 9 mass public school shootings. Okay, Germany has had 3, but the United States has over 340 million people. Germany has like 84 million people. So that's like 4 times the population. So you adjust for that, that would be the equivalent of the United States having 12 mass public school shootings. Finland, over that period of time, has had 2 mass public school shootings. Well, they have like 5.5 million people there. So it's like 1/60th. That'd be the equivalent of the United States on a per capita rate having 120 that's there. Russia has had literally dozen, mass public school shootings, and yet they have, not quite that many, but they have a much smaller population than the United States has. So people don't make comparisons across the whole world, and they don't adjust for population.
I'll tell you one thing on that. In the lead up to this interview, I had a look at the mass shootings in Australia in history, just even over the last several decades. And I was surprised how many mass shootings there were in Australia. And it's one of those things you kind of forget that that's the case. So as you scan through them, there's actually quite a lot that have taken place in Australia too. But on the recent one, in terms of Bondi, no one wants to have shootings, no one wants to have death, right?
Of course.
That's not what this is about. But one of the concerns that seems to have come out several times in the Bondi massacre is the fact that we're seeing responses from government that are to restrict the law-abiding citizen even more. And I had one educator put it to me like this. He said, the response to Bondi is akin to punishing your entire class because of the trouble created by one student.
Right. Well, I guess I'd phrase it a little bit differently, and that gets back to what we were talking about before. You have a law that creates gun-free zones, all right? Bad guys take advantage of that. It's actually a magnet for them doing the attacks. And rather than going and undoing the original law that made it possible and created the tragedy, they want to have more restrictions that are there. And, you know, I just mentioned France, for example, where 130 people were killed. France has even stricter gun control laws than Australia's had. Yeah. And yet, you know, and Germany has extremely strict gun control laws. And yet they've, on a per capita rate, had more mass public school shootings than the United States. You know, in both of those countries, you're talking about a process that literally takes thousands of dollars to go and get a permit. You have to go through multiple psychological screening tests. It can take over a year. France bans all semi-automatic guns, completely bans them. You know, you have all these restrictions and stuff. And you know, the thing is, who are you mainly affecting with these laws that are there? And so my concern is there are a lot of good people out in the world. There's a few really bad people. And so if you make it so that the law-abiding people can't defend themselves, you know, it'd be great if the police were there all the time. And before we mentioned the difficulties police have because they're in uniform, which makes it harder for them to go and stop these attacks and riskier for their own safety. You know, for the life of me, I have a hard time understanding why the government won't allow even private security for the Jewish groups to be able to go and have guns for protection. You know, if the government can promise that it will protect people all the time, you know, great, you know, but they're not doing that, and they're not going to be able to go and do that. And we've already talked about how Australia has a higher violent crime rate than the United States by a lot. I did, maybe one thing I could have mentioned earlier, you know, just even comparing murder rates between Australia and the United States. The United States is very unique compared to other countries in terms of how geographically concentrated murders are. 2% of the counties in the United States account for 56% of the murders. And if you ever look at a murder map, what you see is that in those 2%, basically 2/3 of their murders take place in 10-block areas within those counties. And it's basically drug gang activity. You know, so you have like 54% or so of the counties in the United States have 0 murders in any given year. Another 16% have like 1 murder. So, and those, by the way, happen to be the counties with the highest gun ownership rates. And, you know, so it's, people I think have this kind of very misleading view of murder in the United States.
Given that the guns used in the Bondi attack were registered to the father, while the son was on the ASIO watch list, so our securities watch list, would this relationship usually be picked up in a gun license check? When the gun license of the father expired and was reapplied for in 2020, the license took 3 years to be granted.
Right.
Is stronger gun licenses and cross-agency assessment of gun licenses one of the answers?
Well, you know, the thing is, if somebody's planning an attack years or a long time in advance, it's usually pretty hard to stop them from getting weapons. In the United States, I mean, I don't know exactly how long in advance this attack was being planned. I know the younger guy went to the Philippines essentially for training for these types of things. Presumably, he probably was in his mind at that point. maybe much earlier. In the United States, it's rare to see people plan these attacks less than 6 months in advance. And some of them are planned for years in advance. And if somebody's planning something long in advance, it's really hard to stop them from getting weapons. And there's a whole range of weapons that they can use. You look at something like the Nice vehicle attack that was there. You had like over 80 people killed. You had something like 500 people injured or something like that in that attack. There are other, you have vehicles here in Australia, obviously. You have parades, you have other things that are going on that people could go and kill people. It's easy for people with relatively common items to make a bomb or other things that are there. We had the Boston Marathon bombing that people had made with just pressure cookers and stuff. And, and they can get that type of information from the internet. And so the problem that you face is that if you have to be careful that the laws that you're putting there aren't primarily stopping law-abiding citizens. So I know the American background check system for guns in detail. And I don't have quite the information. It's not publicly known in Australia. But in the United States, since they started the background check system federally, there have been about 5 million people that have been denied being able to purchase guns. And they're often described as dangerous individuals. The problem is that in the United States, about 99% of those are mistakes. It's one thing to stop somebody with a felony background from buying guns. Another thing to stop somebody simply because they have a roughly phonetically similar name and similar background and similar birthday. And the problem is it primarily discriminates against blacks and Hispanics. When you're looking at roughly phonetically similar names, people have similar names to others in their racial groups. Hispanics have names similar to Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. 34% of black males in the United States have felony records. 18% of Hispanic males have felony records. 6% of white males have felony records, and about 1.5% of Asian males have felony records. Well, if you're going to look at things like roughly phonetically similar names and similar birthdays, you can kind of guess where the mistakes are going to be occurring. They're going to be overwhelmingly with Hispanic and black males that are there. And so through no fault of their own, now you can go and hire a lawyer, which is going to cost you a couple $1,000s to go and appeal and to get things fixed. But you basically set up something so that middle income and poor black and Hispanic males who maybe just want to get a gun to protect themselves and their families are being stopped through no fault of their own, simply because of the way the government background check system is. So I have no idea. I mean, you mentioned a mistake that's here. I mean, God only knows what was going through their mind, why it took 3 years to go through the process. Presumably there were some flags that were there, or just bureaucratic incompetence, or who knows. I don't know. It'd be good to do an investigation into those things. And I guess there's been a debate about doing an investigation or not here in Australia.
Yeah, there has been. There was a concern raised by another young person as well that said Australian politicians' reaction was to rush and ultimately pass gun reform and anti-hate bills.
Right.
What effect do you expect to see with this in place?
Well, I think it's just going to primarily disarm law-abiding citizens relative to criminals. See, that's the one big difference between Australia and the United States. You have a parliamentary system, which makes it very easy to go and pass things quickly, kind of in the heat of the moment that's there. In the United States, we have a House of Representatives, a Senate, a president. They have different constituent mixes that are there, and they could represent different parties and stuff. Plus, we have a filibuster in the Senate, which requires that you have to get 60 votes, basically, to get anything controversial passed. And so there's just a lot more inertia in our system, which kind of allows tempers to simmer a little bit, and people kind of look at things. But I have to say, One of the other big problems that I think Australia has is with academia. You have much more groupthink here than you have in the United States. In the United States, on a lot of different topics, maybe not as much as there used to be, but you can usually find somebody who can go and say, you know, your numbers are wrong here, or something like that. And it's really interesting just to see the debate here in Australia on these things, because there's just so much statistical malpractice that's going on. It's really outrageous. So I'll give you an example. One of the common things after the 96, 97 gun confiscation is there are all these claims about how you have this big drop in firearm homicides and firearm suicides that occur after the confiscation. The thing is, and I assume academics know this because it's pretty well understood, is that often just looking at simple before and after averages can be extremely misleading. And so let me give you an example. Let's say you had crime was falling at a perfectly straight line over the entire period that you had there. You could pick any point along that line, and the after average is going to obviously be below the before average. But I'm looking at it, and it's falling at exactly the same rate before and after. I'm saying, it's pretty hard to go and see that the law had any effect. It's falling at exactly the same rate before and after. And what you would like to see is, does it fall at a faster rate or a slower rate? Is there some discontinuity that's occurring in the line? There are other examples one could give. You could take something like a perfectly inverted V, okay, where the law changes right at the peak. If it's perfectly symmetrical, the after average is the same as the before average, right? But I look at it and said, look, it's going up and then it's falling. Something changed there, okay? Now, whether it's the law that just happened to do it when something else changed or not, that's a different question. But looking at the before and after average is a pretty useless way of doing it. But yet that's all the debate is here. And the thing is, when you look at something like firearm homicides or firearm suicides, they were falling for 15 years prior to the confiscation. Firearm homicides actually stopped falling for about 8 years afterwards. Firearm suicides continue to fall, but at a slower rate than they were beforehand. You know, if anything, I look at that and I say, this is not going the way you guys would have predicted it would go. But there are other problems with it too, that you would hope that you'd have academics who would be willing to go and point these things out. So for example, why just look at firearm homicides and suicides? Why not like total suicides? Total suicides actually increased by about 20% right after the confiscation. Now, I'm not going to go and argue that the confiscation caused suicides to rise, but the thing is, there are different ways for people to commit suicide. If I lower firearm suicides and people just switched into other ways of doing it, is that a net gain that's occurring there? Or if I see a drop in firearm homicides, but an increase in total homicides, which is what happened, is that a gain that's happening there? But yet there's like no discussion on those issues. Or just take the fact that when the confiscation occurred, there was about a 29% drop in firearm ownership that occurred at the confiscation. But over time, people were able to buy guns again. And at least by 2010, the gun ownership rate in Australia was above what it was prior to the confiscation. Well, if gun control advocates are right, you should have seen an immediate sharp drop in firearm homicides and suicides, and then an increase over time as the gun ownership rate was increasing. You don't see anything like that at all. As I said, firearm homicides were falling, and it stopped falling. There's no sudden drop and an increase. It basically was flat for a while, and total homicides went up. So those are just simple, obvious things that you would hope that there was some academics here in the country that would have at least a basic understanding of statistics and how to measure things that would go and point those things out. But, I've had Keston Green and I had an op-ed a few years ago in Australian newspaper and stuff on this stuff. And I've testified before the Australian Senate some years ago trying to point this out. But it's like, I don't understand. I don't understand why there's like I mean, these are just, even whatever your view is on guns, you would think somebody would at least say, you can't measure things this way.
Yeah.
This just makes no sense.
Yep. It's a reason, actually, I value the economists like Gigi Foster, Sanjeev Sublock and Cameron Murray, as well as Keston and their involvement for Australians for Science and Freedom, to try and pick up those kinds of things which are not tend to be looked at for whatever reason. They're kind of blind sites in culture. Just as we draw to the end of this interview, there's just a couple of quick questions I thought I'd ask. Trump administration, you reported into the Trump administration? What was
Well, in the first term, I was there.
Yeah.
I was senior advisor for research and statistics.
What was your learning and thoughts from that?
Do I?
What was your learning and opinion on that?
Well, I mean, I've worked in the federal government twice. I was also chief economist for the U.S. Sentencing Commission beforehand. And usually what I tell people is it confirmed all my worst fears about the government. I think the first Trump administration is very different from the second one here. I think he's learned a lot. So during the first administration, he basically relied on George W. Bush's people to go and appoint people in the Department of Justice. And I don't know if you know the ins and outs of American politics, but Bush is just hate Trump, okay? And so, I mean, not only did you have like the civil service people that hated Trump, but you had all these people who were political appointees who hated Trump there. And so that made it very interesting. But I mean, I could tell you stories for hours about kind of the political machinations for just the civil servant people. I can give you one simple story if you want. But so I mentioned before about the errors in the NICS background check system for people getting guns. And I wanted to get the data on the demographics of who the mistakes were involved with. And so I went, when I got there, and it's one of the reasons why I accepted the job, because I wanted to get the data. And so I went there, I talked to the Bureau of Justice Statistics people, and they were very interested. They approached the FBI, which collects the data, and the FBI says, no, we're not interested in looking at this. And the Bureau of Justice Statistics people said, well, it's not your job. You collect the data. It's our job to go and analyze it, so we'd like to look at this. And the FBI came back and they said, well, we don't know why anybody would want to break this down by race and sex. And my response was, you guys break down everything by race and sex. You know, what's the difference here? So anyway, you have to understand this is during COVID. So it's not like you go bang on somebody's door and get them to respond. I'm like the only person that shows up in the office. And you know, you send them emails or phone calls and they just ignore you after a period of time if they don't want to get back to you. So anyway, time goes by. And then 2 days after the election, where Biden was said to have won, the FBI finally gets back to the Bureau of Justice Statistics people, and they say, you're going to have to fill out a FOIA request. This is a Freedom of Information Act request that reporters normally have to do. But this is one part of the Department of Justice asking another part of the Department of Justice for data when it's their job to ask for that data. So nobody ever heard of a FOIA request that they'd have to fill out. And then they said, and then the FBI said, but even if you can fill it out today, there's no way we're going to be able to get to this until after January 20th. And we're sure that the Biden administration will not be interested in this data. So there's really no reason for you to go and even fill this out. So they argue back and forth for a while, and then basically the FBI goes radio silent, just ignoring the things again. So the Thursday before Thanksgiving, I get a call from a friend of mine named Grover Norquist, who's kind of a big inside the Beltway conservative muckety-muck in DC. Grover and I wrote a book together over a decade ago. And Grover knows I'm working at the Department of Justice, and he's supposed to meet the next day with Mark Meadows, the chief of staff for the White House. And Mark wanted to know what the administration could accomplish at the Department of Justice before the end of the administration. And so I gave Grover two ideas. One of them is this thing here. And Grover meets with Mark, who I know a little bit, and Mark likes both of my ideas, and he promises he's going to call up Bill Barr, the Attorney General, on Monday, before Thanksgiving, and he does that. And anyway, it's my understanding that Bill called up or contacted the FBI people, told them to stop goofing around to work with us on this stuff. The next morning, Politico, which is kind of the inside the Beltway politics news outlet, has a story at the very top of their website, the top line there, saying controversial pro-gun academic joins Department of Justice. So apparently what happened was, as soon as the FBI people were told to work on this, they went to the media to complain about having to work on this stuff and say, you know, you got to get rid of this Lott guy. And so anyway, and then all heck broke loose. All the gun control groups were in high dudgeon, you know, going. And I was told by people at the Department of Justice that no one else during the Trump administration had gotten as many calls for being fired or removed as they had for me. So I suppose that's an accomplishment. But they got all these Freedom of Information Act requests. The PR people at Department of Justice were completely freaked out. They were saying, we've never seen so many FOIA requests from so many different organizations about one person at one time. And I said, they're all from the same group. It's like all these Bloomberg groups, you know, Moms Demand Action, Students Demand Action, Everytown, the Trace. I said, they just had a conference call and they say, you asked for this, you asked for this. Then they basically just wanted to bury me with paperwork. They were asking for things like emails back to 2015 and stuff. And so anyway, after a couple weeks, things died down. I won't go through all the stories. And finally, the FBI starts to work on this. And they give the Bureau of Justice Statistics data. And the people at the BJS were saying, you know, this doesn't make sense. These numbers just, I mean, this should be very simple. I mean, you're just saying, just imagine you have an Excel spreadsheet. You're just summing up the columns there. I mean, how could you mess it up? But the numbers didn't make sense. So the BJS people called up the FBI and they said, well, something's wrong with these numbers. And the BJS people said, the FBI people said, oh, we're so sorry. We were just going to call you. We're so glad that you called us. We realized that there was a mistake. We'll fix it and we'll get back to you. It takes like 5 minutes to do the sums on these things. And anyway, a week later, they give the data again to the Bureau of Justice Statistics people, and they say, there's something wrong with this. It makes no sense. And they say, oh, we're so sorry. We'll fix it. We don't know what happened. And that basically happened 4 times. The last time it happened was on January 19th. We're all out the door on January 20th. And the Bureau of Justice people had put together a report on the background check system where one section was going to be on the errors in the NICS system. The Biden administration put out the report, but without that section on the errors, not surprisingly. So anyway, I can give you other stories, but that just gives you one example of kind of how bureaucracies work and stuff, you know.
I think if you decide to change tact, I think you've got a whole episode of The Hollow Man or Yes Minister in just what you've described there.
No, that's a good show, by the way. But
just as one final question, we've talked about a lot of real things, whether it's bureaucracy, whether it's guns, whether it's crime, and they can sound like a lot of negative things. We've talked about the laws. What words of hope or encouragement can you give the viewers of Australians for Science and Freedom on this podcast today?
Well, I think in many parts of the world, things are improving in terms of freedom. You have Milei in Argentina, for example. I mean, that country seemed completely lost. I mean, you look at the change in economic activity over the last year. He's moving. It looks like there may be legislation to make it so that people can carry guns for protection. Chile just had an election. And Ecuador, I think I'm supposed to meet with the president of Ecuador next month sometime to go and talk about some of these very issues that are there. I mean, Ecuador is an interesting case. You try to explain to people kind of the joke about outrunning the bear. You don't need to run faster than the bear. You just have to run faster than whoever you're with. And in 2014 in Ecuador, the socialist government at the time basically kicked out the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration and U.S. military that had a base there. And that made it a relatively attractive place then for the drug cartels to move into more. And they had a very low murder rate at the time, very low crime. It's exploded since then. And when I've been down to Ecuador, invited a couple times. I've met with multiple government officials. I've met with, I gave a talk at the National Police Academy that they've set up there. And corruption is just crazy down there. I mean, the saying that everybody tells you is, you either take the silver or you take a bullet. And, there's huge payments that are made. And you just can't even fix things right now because you don't know who you can trust, and even if you can trust them right now, maybe they'll be bribed when you're trying to do something. I talked to people like the head of the National Election Commission. I talked to people in the courts. I talked to police, and it's just, corruption is just endemic. So they have a hard problem changing, but people know that what was going on wasn't working. And there's that change, and I think there'll be a movement towards freedom there.
Yeah, and maybe that gives us some hope in Australia too, in that process too. I think you're probably right. People can follow you on Twitter or X on John R. Lott Jr. and at crimeresearch.org.
Right.
Is there anywhere else that you...
No, I mean, crimeresearch.org is probably the best. People can sign up for our emails. We send out an email blast once every 2 weeks. And, I work 90-hour weeks or whatever. I'm sure my wife would be happy to complain about that sometimes. But, it just, and she would complain about it. But, it doesn't do us any good to do the work if people don't see it. And, I'm here for a week to try to talk about these different issues, and we do stuff for all over the world.
Yeah, on behalf of Australians for Science and Freedom and myself, I'd like to thank you very much for being here. You've been very generous with your time with us and also with a lot of other people. So
well, you have great people. I mean, people like Gigi Foster and whatever has really, I mean, she's set all this up. So she's amazingly skilled people that you have.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks for your time today.